Hello, everyone. Welcome to Filmmakers. Hope all of you are doing well and keeping safe. Today, to discuss the cinema of Abbas Kiarostami, we have with us Mr. Godfrey Cheshire. Godard had famously remarked that film begins with D.W. Griffith and ends with Abbas Kiarostami. For me, watching the cinema of Abbas Kiarostami is like watching the work of God. And today, we have with us someone who has been touched by God. Godfrey Cheshire is a film critic, journalist, and filmmaker based in New York City. He founded Rayleigh's Spectator magazine. He served for a decade as the chief film critic of New York Press. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Variety, Film Comment, The Village Voice, Interview, Criterion, and so many other publications. Godfrey has won 3 Arts Criticism Awards from the Association of Alternative News Weeklies. His areas of special interest include Iranian cinema, the conversion to digital cinema, and cinematic representations of the American South. He is a former chairman of the New York Film Critics Circle and a member of the National Society of Film Critics. Godfrey, thank you so much for joining us today. It is such a pleasure to have you on our channel.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to this discussion.
I will just jump to the first question, which I wanted to ask you. And before that, maybe if I tell you a little bit about how I feel about Abbas Kiarostami, because I don't know whether I will get the chance to meet you or not. You know, I have been a student of statistics, and when I think about cinema and when I think about Godard, that appears to me like a Planck's constant, very elegant, but very difficult to understand. And when I think about Satyajit Ray, it feels like gravity to me. It pulls me towards my own country. It pulls the entire world towards India and Indian cinema. And when I think about Abbas Kiarostami, it feels like the discovery of zero. Like the whole world is based on this cinema. If the zero is not here, then I feel that the world cinema falls apart. So I just wanted to tell you what I personally feel about Abbas Kiarostami. And we also know your love and association with him and with Iranian cinema. And your book on Iranian cinema was Writings of Iranian Cinema with the prefix in the time of Kiarostami. Tell us about this prefix. Like, why on Kiarostami when you are talking about the whole Iranian cinema?
Okay. Well, first of all, you know, I've had one book come out so far. That's called Conversations with Karastami. And that's a series of interviews that I did with him. And that's out now. But the other book that you mentioned, In the Time of Kiarostami, Writings on Iranian Cinema, will be published in January of 2023. I've been working on it for some time. I now have a publisher for it, and you know, we're going to put it out then. But the thing is, In the Time of Kiarostami, is the title is meant to say that this book is about more than just Kiarostami. It's about placing Kiarostami in the context of his times and his place, namely Iran, right? So I started writing about Iranian cinema in the early 90s and then started going to Iran in the late 90s and got to know Kiarostami pretty well, got to be friends with him during that time. And, you know, one thing that always struck me was I felt that people outside of Iran, in the West especially, didn't really understand the culture that he came out of, the cinematic culture, especially in Iran, which was really interesting and which had a number of great directors. People tended to look at him, if they were looking from outside Iran, as just this one very exceptional superstar director. But there were other really good ones too. So when I went to assembling this book, the book is a combination of pieces that I've written in the past and some new pieces I've written to fill in. And the idea is sort of just to give, to preserve some of those pieces that I wrote in the past that people are still interested in, but also to sort of show my my progression in understanding this this subject matter, and let people see Kiarostami in the context of my reporting and in the context of the cinema that he came out of, that I got to know something about by going to Iran 7 times in recent years and really getting to know the filmmakers and really studying the film scene there.
Godfrey, there's a very interesting episode that I read from one of your writings, which talks about your association as well as the friendship with Abbas, where you talk about one photograph that he presented to you. If we could please talk about that episode, and you know, it kind of both shows the person, the human being, as well as his cinematic look, his photographic look, maybe if we could talk about that.
Yes. Well, he was a very avid photographer and a very great photographer, and he had exhibits of his photographs all around the world. And one time when I was visiting in Tehran, and I went to his house, he said, before you leave the country, I want to give you a gift. I want to give you one of my photographs. And I was, oh, great. And so he said, okay, well, let me show you some and you can tell me which one you like the best. And so I sat down across the table from him, and he had all these photographs that were mounted, and he started showing them to me like one at a time. And I mean, he did this like, maybe let me look about 10 seconds for every photograph, but it must have been like 50 or 60 photographs. And at the end, I said, this one in particular, I really like. And he said, okay, I'll have a print made for you. And then when I went back right before I left the country to see him and to get the print, he said, I have something to tell you I'm sorry about, but that print, the negative, was damaged in the lab. But I have another photograph for you that was like the second most favorite photograph when I showed them to you. And he showed it to me, and he was right. It was my second most favorite. And I hadn't said anything about that. He just read my face from every photograph I looked at. I thought that was amazing that he could do that. It actually made me think about Robert Bresson, because there's a story about how he went to make the film that became Lancelot du Lac sometime, I think, in the 40s. And, he always cast people by their looks. And he found this woman who he thought was perfect for Queen Guinevere. But then the film got through and never got finished. And so 20 or so years later, he went back and cast it again when he could make it. And the woman whose face he found turned out to be the daughter of the woman he had cast 20 some years before. And, I think great directors have a very, very particular eye, and that feeds into their sort of whole artistic vision. And I think that was the case with Kiarostami.
I want to talk about Close Up, and specifically the article which you wrote about Close Up. You said that the film interrogates the process and purposes of cinema.
Yes.
If you could please elaborate your thought process behind this statement.
Right. Well, I don't know if your audience, most of them will have seen Close Up, but just to tell those who may not have seen it what it is about, it is a sort of it's hard to come up with a term for it exactly. It's kind of like a fake documentary, but it's using real elements. There was an incident in which a young man was arrested and accused of impersonating the director of Mohsen Makhmalbaf to a well-off Tehran family. He told them he'd put him in his next film, everything, and then he was captured. And then Kiarostami, when he learned about this by reading a magazine article, decided that he wanted to make a film about it. So he did, and he started filming. He'd go to the police station, filmed the young man who was arrested in prison, and then filmed the man's trial and the aftermath. But a lot of this was stuff that, even though it appears to be a documentary, Kiarostami is sort of orchestrating everything. He's using the various real people for fictional purposes. And I think that it raises so many questions. I mean, ethical questions, but also I think he's showing something about the way that cinema operates in society, in the sense that these people are really the people that are accusing the young man and the young man himself are both devotees of cinema, and they are caught up in a society that assigns certain values to cinema. And the film is looking at that, and it's looking about how people are both connected by cinema and separated, because this young man and the family are miles apart in terms of their sociological places, and yet film can bring them together. But at the end of the day, film also reminds you of how far apart they are. And I think there's something in that idea that touches on things in other Kiarostami films, in that I think he's registering something about the disappointment that a lot of people felt in the results of the Iranian Revolution, which happened in 1979. And Close Up was made just a decade later. It was made in the fall of '89 and released in 1990. And I think that Iranian society had gone through a period of great fervor and high expectations regarding the post-revolutionary society. And in fact, I think a lot of people hoped that it would, rid Iran of class divisions and of poverty and these kinds of things. Whereas this film reminds us that that didn't happen. And a lot of the ideals of the revolution were not brought to fruition, certainly by the time this film were made, and going down the line too. I think that is an idea, a subtle idea that runs through a number of Kiarostami's films in this period. There are also other ideas, but one thing about Kiarostami's films is that he practiced a kind of a poetic method. And I think his films are most comparable to modern poetry. And they have many layers of meaning that it's up to the viewer to sort of contemplate. Kiarostami talked about making half-made films, like films where half of it, the meaning has to be supplied by the viewer. But I think it's very deliberate on his part in the way that he does this and the subtleties that he uses to sort of incorporate various strands and levels of meaning.
There's also very interesting, the image of Iran that we get in Close Up. Frankly, for me, I watched Close Up much later than the Kuka trilogy or a few other Iranian films as well. It's very different from the way Iran we've seen other films. Particularly if I talk about, say, the character of the judge. We are used to seeing a very conservative, going by the rule book kind of, judiciary or executive for Iran or for that matter for the Middle East. Here we see the judge is kind of, he wants this person to be forgiven as if.
Yes.
And, cinema, the way, people are connected to through cinema. So do you feel that was purposeful on the behalf of Kiarostami, that he represented the other side of Iran in this film?
Well, I think he presented various sides of it. I think that he presented, certainly the image of Iran where you have these different social classes, but all of them are kind of absorbed with cinema. When I went to Iran the first time, I went with a great deal of curiosity based on Close Up. I was like, are people really this crazy about movies? And really, I'd never seen anything quite like that in any other society. But I found that was really true, that people at that point especially were really, really absorbed with cinema. And in some ways it was like people had fallen away from religion and were falling toward the worship of cinema or belief in cinema in a way. And, and also fallen away from belief in the revolution toward belief in cinema. And, the Islamic Republic had banned a lot of other art forms. And so cinema, which it supported, had a kind of a privileged place, and people really, really, really responded to it and latched onto it for a lot of different reasons. But the thing about the trial where you see the judge, the Islamic judge, being very sympathetic and understanding to all the people that are in front of him, it really is kind of surprising. I do think that was kind of realistic, but at the same time, you have to realize that Kiarostami basically manipulated everyone that was in this film, including the judge. And he got the judge really to perform in the way that he wanted the judge to perform. He didn't feed him lines or anything like that, but he set up the situation and he controlled the situation. The judge gave him permission to film, and a trial like that is not normally done anything like that. Kiarostami staged it as a movie trial, and the judge played his part, which is really fascinating. So it's commenting both on what the reality is in Iranian society, but also on the way that cinema interacts with and distorts or glamorizes that.
Continuing with Close Up, Godfrey, we
Yes.
wanted to talk about the very interesting sequence related to this aerosol can, which was kicked around when the police comes to arrest Hussain Sabzi. And this apparently, if we talk about that, a person kicking the aerosol can going down the road, it doesn't really add much to the narrative of the movie. But again, it has some intriguing power and impact. It has a certain visual appeal to it. And we also find that across Kiarostami's filmography, these sequences, which do not actually maybe add to the narrative, but visually are stunning and feel very, very powerful. So why do you think he conceived these kind of ideas, and why do you think these ideas have such an impact on viewers like us?
Well, in my book, Conversations with Kiarostami, I talked to him for a long time about Close Up. And I just really regret that I didn't ask him about that aerosol can at any point. But I have a feeling he would have probably said, oh, that was just something that happened that I filmed that I thought would be cool to put in there. The thing to realize about that sequence is the opening sequence of the film. It's such an unusual thing. First of all, we see these people coming out of a police station and getting into a car. Two of them are soldiers. One of them is the reporter who will write the story that Kiarostami eventually sees about the arrest of the Makhmalbaf impersonator. And then the other one is the driver. And then we see them driving out to the home of the family, and they have this conversation that talks about various things. But then when they get there, the reporter, people go inside, the cab driver stays outside. Now, normally in a film, what would happen when they arrive at the house is that the film would go inside the house with them and show the arrest of the Makhmalbaf impersonator. But this is where Close-Up's idiosyncrasy begins. It doesn't go inside the house. You don't even know what's going to happen. Instead, it stays outside with the cab driver, the least important person in the whole movie, perhaps. But he looks up at the sky. He sees a jet plane going on. He sees some flowers on a garbage heap, and then this aerosol can gets kicked and rolls down the street. And you're going, what is the point of this? But the point is, I think it's in a way showing. I think it's a kind of a humorous symbol for Kiarostami's own method, which is to let something go. He told me about when I would talk to him about how he directed actors, especially the young non-actors that were in a lot of his films. He quoted a poem by Rumi about hitting a ball like a polo ball and just letting it go and then following it. And he said, that's what I do. And I think the aerosol can is a way of showing that same thing. But it also is, that whole scene is an example of his poetic cinema, where he's setting up a rhyme, and the rhyme is finished at the end of the film when the people come, Makhmalbaf and the young man come back to the same house, and they're bringing flowers that are very much like the flowers that were in the first scene, if you notice. So it's all very clever and very subtle and very idiosyncratic. I mean, he is establishing his own sort of approach to film language and narrative by what he does in these scenes.
Right. There's this very unique thing about, one is this law and one is this imagination that we have in Close-Up, and they keep on conflicting. What the rules say, the social rules or the moral rules, at times the imagination kind of wants to transcend that, and we get into a conflict. And that might not be only for this film. It might be, for so many other films in Kiarostami's filmography, or for that matter, in our real life as well. So yes. Did you ever have any kind of discussion about particularly Close-Up or this aspect that keeps on coming in his films? In the film, we see that the love of art and what he did out of that is in conflict with what is the legal law for the
yes,
land.
That's right. That's a theme that is goes through a lot of Kiarostami, and yes. It certainly is very central. That question is very central to his work. When he told me in my interviews, the last thing that he said about Close-Up, summing it up, was that, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that it's about the power of imagination. That you can be in prison, but the imagination can take you out of prison, that nothing can really confine the imagination. And I think that he basically, from a philosophical standpoint, sees life as this battle between reality, given reality, and imagination. And of course, the artist's imagination can transform the reality. I think that is a key concept in the way that he deals with this.
Yeah, I mean, for me also, he feels so much like a philosopher. It's not only a filmmaker, he feels like a philosopher.
I totally agree with that. Yes, I do definitely agree with that.
And tell me something, Godfrey. I mean, from my understanding of Iranian cinema or whatever I have read, Makhmalbaf himself was a very different filmmaker or coming from a very different ideology than Kiarostami. So later, how did this collaboration happen where they worked on the same film of a very different type? I mean, I'm not very sure at that time whether, they were following similar ideologies at that time.
Well, no, they were very, very different people and very, very different artists. Kiarostami came from the generation of the pre-revolutionary filmmakers who were after the revolution, eventually, and most of them were invited back to resume working. But the pre-revolutionary filmmakers were called the Iranian New Wave during the 1970s, and there were a lot of really good directors that came out of that. Makhmalbaf, on the other hand, came up after the revolution. He was, in fact, an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist before the revolution. He, as a teenager, he attacked a police station. He was wounded, sent to prison, and tortured for 4 years before he was released by the revolution. And when he came out, he was a really hardcore Islamist ideologue. And he started making speeches and writing plays, and then started making films that were very, very crude. But he got more and better as a filmmaker. And at the same time, he became more and more sort of questioning of the Islamic ideology that he had espoused. And so he became much more of a free thinker by the time that Close Up happens. And he also, though, had during the previous years had denounced the pre-revolutionary directors who were resuming work in very harsh terms. And so Kiarostami, when he met Makhmalbaf, was very worried about, what he was all about and nervous about it. And what happened was that after this article came out that told about the arrest of the Makhmalbaf impersonator, Makhmalbaf had seen Kiarostami somewhere and said he'd like to talk to him about a script he had. And so they set up an appointment. Makhmalbaf came to Kiarostami's office. This magazine was in the about the impersonator was in the office. Kiarostami said he proposed the idea of making a film about that. Makhmalbaf said it was his idea when I interviewed them separately. But in any case, they went from there to the house of the family who had been defrauded, which was a very funny scene because they ring the buzzer that you see at the end of the film, and somebody in the family says, "Who's there?" And Kiarostami says, "Kiarostami," and there's a long pause, and then the person says, "We just got rid of a fake Makhmalbaf. How do I know that it's the real Kiarostami?" And he says, "Because I've got the real Makhmalbaf, and he's right here in the car." So they both go in, and Makhmalbaf basically says they stay up late drinking tea, and by the end, Kiarostami has convinced all of them to be in Close Up with him directing. And so what happens is that after that, Makhmalbaf goes off to make a film of his own in another city. And then Kiarostami does all the filming that he does on Close Up. And it's after the trial has been filmed and everything that he films the young man getting out of prison and Makhmalbaf coming to meet him. I think that's the right chronology. But in any case, Makhmalbaf interacted with Kiarostami and with Close Up just briefly, kind of at the beginning and at the end of the story that we see. But he didn't, their ideologies, I think, were much more similar at this point than they had been earlier. But they didn't remain close at all. I think that they both sort of respected each other and felt a tie through Close Up, but they didn't collaborate on anything else. And I think that they saw each other very, very infrequently after that.
That's such an interesting trivia, actually, Godfrey. Nobody else could tell that.
For 10 years after he started making films at the Revolution, he made films about children mainly. He said they were about children, not necessarily for children, because for him, the most important thing by far was casting, finding the right child for the role. And then once he found the child for the role, he just let the child inhabit the role. He was criticized by some in Iran for using Western music in some cases, like Vivaldi, for example. But he just said he took music from wherever he wanted it.